Jane Marple was not the sort of woman to refuse an invitation from an old friend, especially when it came with an undertone of worry. Ruth Van Rydock, a sophisticated and worldly woman, had reached out to Miss Marple with a sense of urgency. Ruth believed that something sinister was happening at Stonygates, the grand Victorian mansion where her sister, Carrie Louise Serocold, resided with her husband Louis and a collection of troubled youths in their care. Ruth had always been protective of Carrie Louise. Despite her sister's calm and gentle demeanor, Ruth was certain that something was deeply wrong at Stonygates. And so, with her characteristic blend of curiosity and quiet resolve, Miss Marple boarded the train bound for Stonygates. The mansion itself was a sprawling estate, its grandeur slightly faded with time. Miss Marple's sharp eyes immediately noted the peculiar atmosphere. The house was well kept, but there was a palpable tension beneath the surface. Carrie Louise welcomed Miss Marple warmly, her smile genuine but carrying a shadow of concern. "Jane, I'm so glad you came," Carrie Louise said softly as they sat down for tea in the drawing room. "Ruth worries too much, but things have felt strange lately." Miss Marple pressed her friend gently for details. Carrie Louise explained that her husband, Louis Serocold, was deeply invested in his work with young offenders, believing in rehabilitation through education and kindness. Several of the young men now resided at Stonygates as part of this program. While Carrie Louise admired Louis's dedication, she admitted that there had been unsettling incidents, strange noises in the night, missing items, and whispers among the staff about trouble brewing. As Miss Marple listened, she observed the room carefully. The polished mirrors reflecting the firelight, the symmetrical arrangement of the furniture, the subtle but deliberate placement of objects. Everything appeared orderly, yet Miss Marple sensed a pattern of deception beneath the surface. "I'm sure it's nothing," Carrie Louise insisted with a nervous laugh. "Louis says I'm imagining things." Miss Marple smiled kindly, but her sharp mind was already assembling the pieces of a puzzle not yet fully revealed. "You know, my dear," she said softly, "people often hide things in plain sight, like a magician's trick with mirrors." Just as Carrie Louise opened her mouth to respond, the sound of a gunshot echoed through the hall. The teacup slipped from Carrie Louise's hand and shattered on the marble floor. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed as she rose from her seat. "Stay here," she instructed. With a steady hand, she moved toward the source of the sound. Somewhere within the walls of Stonygates, the first piece of the deadly puzzle had just fallen into place. Miss Marple's footsteps were light but purposeful as she followed the echo of the gunshot down the corridor. Stonygates was unnervingly quiet, the kind of silence that follows a violent act. Her sharp gaze flicked toward the glint of a brass doorknob at the end of the hall. The study door stood slightly ajar. Carefully pushing it open, Miss Marple stepped inside and froze. A man lay sprawled on the carpet, his body twisted unnaturally. Blood was seeping into the rich fibers beneath him, the source of the crimson stain hidden beneath his shoulder. A revolver lay inches from his outstretched hand. Carrie Louise's stepdaughter, Mildred Street, appeared in the doorway, her eyes wide with horror. "What happened?" she gasped. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened as she knelt beside the body. She touched the man's wrist, no pulse. Her keen eyes took in the details, the direction of the blood flow, the position of the gun, and the strange angle of the victim's hand. "Who is he?" Miss Marple asked softly. "That's Christian Gulbranson," Mildred said breathlessly. "He's one of the trustees of the Stonygates estate. He arrived this afternoon to speak with Louis." Miss Marple's brow furrowed. "Did you hear the gunshot?" Mildred nodded, clutching the doorframe. "Yes, I was upstairs. I thought it was one of the boys acting up again." Miss Marple's eyes drifted toward the wall of mirrors on the far side of the study. The polished glass reflected the entire room, the overturned chair, the position of the body, and the revolver glinting in the firelight. She approached the nearest mirror and studied it closely. Just then, Louis Serocold burst into the room, followed closely by Dr. Max Hallowell, the estate's physician. Louis's face was ashen as he took in the scene. "Christian," he breathed, crossing to the body. He knelt beside it, shaking his head in disbelief. "Louis," Miss Marple said gently, "do you know why Mr. Gulbranson was here?" Louis's expression darkened. He mentioned something about the estate's finances, some irregularities. He was worried. But I can't believe, he stopped, glancing toward the revolver. It looks like suicide. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Perhaps, she said thoughtfully. Or perhaps it was made to look that way. Dr. Hallowell examined the body. His mouth set in a grim line. Gunshot wound to the chest. Death would have been immediate. But the gun is in his right hand, Miss Marple observed. And the entry wound is from the left side. Lewis frowned. That's impossible. Christian was right-handed. Miss Marple's expression tightened. Exactly, she murmured. From the hallway came the sound of hurried footsteps. Alex Rees-Sterrick, Carrie Louise's stepson from her first marriage, appeared in the doorway. His dark eyes flicked toward the body and then toward Miss Marple. What's happened? He demanded. Miss Marple's gaze was steady. That, she said quietly, is what we must uncover. As the others exchanged uneasy glances, Miss Marple returned her attention to the mirror. There was something off about the reflection, an angle that didn't quite match reality. Her sharp eyes narrowed. Mirrors, after all, were meant to deceive. Miss Marple stood quietly in the study, her gaze lingering on the mirror's reflection. The symmetry of the room was almost too perfect. The polished wood, the immaculate arrangement of furniture, and yet something was off. It wasn't just the body on the floor or the gun resting unnaturally in Christian Gulbrinson's hand. It was a feeling that the room had been staged, that someone had gone to great lengths to make the scene appear as a suicide. Louis Serocold was speaking in hushed tones with Dr. Hallowell near the body, while Mildred sat on the edge of a velvet armchair, wringing her hands. Alex Rees-Sterrick remained standing in the doorway, his sharp eyes flicking toward the mirror before looking away. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Alex, she said softly, you were close to Mr. Gulbrinson, were you not? Alex's dark eyes met hers. Not particularly, he replied coolly. Christian was more involved with the estate's business side. I prefer to keep my distance from such matters. Yet you arrived rather quickly after the shot was fired, Miss Marple observed. Alex's jaw tightened. I was in the West Wing. I heard the sound and came to see what had happened. Miss Marple's lips pursed thoughtfully. I see. Carrie Louise entered the room then, her face pale. She moved toward Louis, who took her hand protectively. Louis, this is dreadful, she whispered. Poor Christian. Indeed, Miss Marple agreed. But I fear it may be more than dreadful. It may be deliberate. Carrie Louise's eyes widened. You mean murder? Miss Marple's gaze moved toward the mirror again. It's too soon to say with certainty, she replied carefully. But I do find it curious that Christian, a right-handed man, would shoot himself with his left hand. Louis's face darkened. Then who? Miss Marple's expression remained calm, but her eyes were piercing. That is precisely what we must determine. A knock at the study door drew their attention. Edgar Lawson, Louis's assistant, stood nervously in the doorway. His thin face was flushed, and his hands were trembling. I'm sorry to interrupt, Edgar said hesitantly, but Inspector Curry has arrived. Miss Marple nodded. Good. I imagine he'll have quite a few questions. Louis placed a hand on Edgar's shoulder. Thank you, Edgar. You may return to your work. Edgar hesitated. I just wanted to say, Mr. Gulbrinson was very upset when he arrived. He was speaking to Mr. Serocold about something serious. What was it? Miss Marple asked. Edgar shook his head. I don't know exactly, but I heard him say something about betrayal. Betrayal? Louis repeated, frowning. Edgar nodded. And shortly after the shot, Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Did you see anyone else near the study at that time? Edgar hesitated. No, but I did hear footsteps. Light, quick footsteps. And I saw a shadow pass by the hallway mirror. Miss Marple's head tilted slightly. The mirror again, she murmured. Curious. Inspector Curry entered the study then, a stout man with a lined face and a direct manner. He surveyed the scene grimly before fixing his eyes on Miss Marple. Miss Marple, he said, I understand you were one of the first on the scene? Yes, Miss Marple replied calmly. And I can assure you, Inspector, that this was no accident. and certainly not a suicide. Inspector Curry's gaze sharpened. What makes you so sure? Miss Marple's gaze moved once more toward the mirror. Because, she said softly, mirrors reveal more than they conceal, if you know where to look. Inspector Curry's sharp eyes moved from Miss Marple to the body on the floor. His brow furrowed as he approached Christian Gulbrinson's lifeless form. He crouched beside the body, studying the angle of the gun and the entry wound. You're suggesting that this was staged? Curry asked without looking up. Miss Marple's expression remained composed. Precisely. Inspector Curry glanced toward Louis Serocold. Mr. Serocold, you mentioned that Mr. Gulbrinson was concerned about the estate's finances? Louis nodded solemnly. He had discovered some discrepancies. We were supposed to speak more about it this evening. What sort of discrepancies? Curry pressed. Louis hesitated. He didn't give specifics, only that funds had gone missing, significant amounts. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. And do you have any idea who might have been responsible? Louis shook his head. It's difficult to say. Many people have access to the estate's financial records, trustees, staff, even some of the young men in the rehabilitation program. Inspector Curry stood. So, this could have been a financial motive. Miss Marple's gaze moved once again to the mirror. Possibly. But I suspect it may be more complex than that. Carrie Louise sat down, her hands trembling. Louis, this is terrible. Who would do such a thing? Louis moved to her side, resting a hand on her shoulder. We'll get to the bottom of this. My dear, I promise. Miss Marple's attention shifted to the hallway outside the study. The long corridor was lined with mirrors, their polished surfaces catching the flicker of candlelight. Her sharp eyes traced the reflections, symmetrical but subtly distorted by the imperfect glass. Mirrors, she murmured. Inspector Curry raised an eyebrow. What about them? Miss Marple's gaze remained thoughtful. Mirrors create illusions. They reflect what we expect to see, but not necessarily what is real. At that moment, a shadow moved at the far end of the corridor. A figure, tall and lean, disappeared around the corner. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Excuse me, she said quietly. She slipped out of the study and followed the direction of the shadow. The corridor was dimly lit, the soft glow of wall sconces casting elongated shapes against the polished floor. Her footsteps were soft, but her breath quickened as she turned the corner. Ahead, a narrow side door stood slightly open. Miss Marple pushed it open, revealing a darkened sitting room. Moonlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating a figure standing near the fireplace. Mr. Reesterick? Alex Reesterick turned, his face partially obscured by shadow. Miss Marple, he said, his voice smooth, what are you doing wandering the halls at this hour? I might ask you the same question, Miss Marple replied calmly. Alex smiled faintly. Old habits. I don't sleep well in houses like this. Too much history. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. You were close to Mr. Gulbrinson, you said? Alex's smile tightened. Not particularly. Yet you arrived rather quickly after the shot. Alex's eyes glinted in the moonlight. Lucky timing, I suppose. Miss Marple studied him closely. Or perhaps you knew the shot was coming. Alex's smile faded. What exactly are you implying? Miss Marple stepped closer, her gaze unwavering. Deception, Mr. Reesterick. This house is full of it, reflected in every mirror, hidden behind every gesture. The question is, what part are you playing in it? Alex's expression darkened. Careful, Miss Marple. It's dangerous to go looking for answers in a house of mirrors. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. I've never been afraid of a reflection. Alex's jaw tightened. He stepped past her and disappeared into the corridor, leaving Miss Marple standing alone in the moonlit room. Miss Marple's gaze shifted toward a mirror above the fireplace. A single fingerprint smudged the glass. Small, deliberate, curious, she murmured. Miss Marple stood for a moment longer in the darkened sitting room, her eyes lingering on the smudged fingerprint on the mirror. A deliberate mark, not the careless touch of a hand in passing, but a message, or perhaps a mistake. She reached into her handbag, withdrawing a lace handkerchief. With delicate precision, she pressed it against the glass. lifting the fingerprint. Folding the cloth neatly, she slipped it back into her bag. The sound of footsteps approaching made her turn. Inspector Curry stood in the doorway, his sharp eyes surveying the room. "Miss Marple," he said, "what are you doing here?" Miss Marple's smile was faint, following a shadow. Inspector Curry's eyes narrowed. "And did the shadow have a name?" "Alex Reesterick," Miss Marple replied. Curry's brows lifted. "Reesterick? What was he doing here?" Miss Marple's gaze moved back toward the mirror. "He claimed to be walking the halls, but I suspect his real purpose was quite different." Curry frowned. "Reesterick was in the study earlier. He could have easily tampered with the crime scene before we arrived." "Possibly," Miss Marple said, "but I believe he's playing a deeper game." Curry stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You think there's more to this than just a financial motive?" Miss Marple's expression remained calm, but her eyes were piercing. "I think this house is full of secrets. The key will be determining which of those secrets Christian Gulbranson discovered before he was killed." A soft knock at the door made them both turn. Carrie Louise stood in the doorway, her pale face framed by the dim light from the corridor. "Inspector," she said softly, "Lewis asked me to find you. He's in the study with Dr. Hallowell." Curry nodded. "Thank you, Mrs. Arrowcold." Carrie Louise's eyes moved toward Miss Marple. "Jane, are you sure you're not overexerting yourself?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "I'm quite well, dear." Carrie Louise hesitated, her delicate hands twisting together. I can't understand why anyone would harm Christian." Miss Marple's gaze softened. "We will find the truth, Carrie Louise. I promise you." Carrie Louise smiled faintly and turned away, her soft footsteps fading down the hall. Inspector Curry's eyes darkened. "You think Mrs. Arrowcold knows more than she's saying?" Miss Marple's expression remained thoughtful. "Carrie Louise is a gentle soul, but gentle souls often see more than they let on." Curry's jaw tightened. "I need to speak with Reesterick." Miss Marple touched his arm lightly. "Patience, Inspector. Sometimes the most revealing truths are not found in words, but in silence." Curry gave her a sharp look. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the mirror once more. "A trick with mirrors. Inspector, someone is making us see only what they want us to see." Curry's eyes darkened. "You think someone staged this?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I think someone created an illusion and hoped we wouldn't notice the hand behind it." A distant sound echoed through the hall, the creaking of floorboards, followed by the soft closing of a door. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "I believe the game has begun in earnest," she murmured. Later that evening, Miss Marple sat with Carrie Louise in the drawing room. A soft fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering light across the polished surfaces of the room. "You've always been so perceptive, Jane," Carrie Louise said softly. "Even as a girl." Miss Marple smiled. "And you've always been kind, Carrie Louise. Too kind, perhaps." Carrie Louise's delicate hands trembled as she reached for her teacup. "Do you think this house is cursed?" "No," Miss Marple replied calmly. "But I do believe someone in this house is dangerous." Carrie Louise's eyes widened. "You mean one of us?" Miss Marple's gaze darkened. "There are many kinds of deception, my dear, but the most dangerous kind is the one we least suspect." The sound of footsteps in the hallway made them both turn. Alex Reesterick entered, his eyes sharp beneath the soft glow of the chandelier. "Ladies," he said smoothly, "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all," Miss Marple replied. Alex's gaze moved toward Carrie Louise. "Mrs. Arrowcold, I wanted to express my condolences for your loss. Christian was a good man." Carrie Louise's smile was thin. "Thank you, Alex." Miss Marple's eyes remained on Alex. His posture was too composed, too deliberate. She watched as his gaze flicked toward the mirror above the fireplace. Miss Marple's lips pressed together thoughtfully. "Do you often find yourself drawn to mirrors, Mr. Reesterick?" Alex's eyes glinted. "Why do you ask?" Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "Because mirrors reveal more than just a reflection. They reveal intent." Alex's smile remained fixed. "Careful, Miss Marple. You might not like what you see." Miss Marple's smile was faint. I rarely do, but that's never stopped me from looking. Alex's eyes lingered on her for a moment longer before he turned and left the room. Miss Marple's gaze followed him. Carrie Louise, she said softly, do you trust him? Carrie Louise hesitated. I think so. Alex has always been kind to me. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Kindness and honesty are not the same thing, my dear. Carrie Louise's hands tightened around her teacup. You think he's lying? Miss Marple's expression darkened. I think he's hiding something, and I intend to find out what it is. The next morning dawned gray and overcast. A thin mist clung to the grounds of Stonygates, curling along the stone walls and seeping to the bare branches of the trees. Miss Marple sat at a small table near the large bay window of the morning room, her hands wrapped around a delicate china teacup. Her eyes were sharp, focused not on the misty landscape outside, but on the distorted reflection in the window pane. A shadow moved across the lawn. Alex Rees-Derrick, walking briskly toward the stables. He paused, glancing toward the house, toward Miss Marple, before disappearing into the mist. Behind her, the door opened softly. Gina Hutt's delicate voice broke the quiet. Good morning, Aunt Jane. Miss Marple turned. Good morning, my dear. Gina slipped into a chair across from her, her bright blue eyes dimmed with worry. Her dark curls were pinned back loosely, and her hands trembled slightly as she poured herself a cup of tea. I can't stop thinking about Christian, Gina said softly. He was always so kind to me when I was a child. Miss Marple's gaze softened. Yes, he was a kind man, which makes his death all the more unsettling. Gina's eyes darkened. Do you think it was someone in the house? Miss Marple's expression remained composed. I believe it is highly likely. Gina hesitated, setting her teacup down with a soft clink. Alex was acting strange last night. After you left the drawing room, he went straight to the library. He didn't see me, but I watched him from the hall. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. And what was he doing? Gina's lips pressed together. He was searching through Christian's briefcase. Miss Marple's brow lifted slightly. Did he take anything? Gina nodded slowly. Yes, an envelope. Miss Marple's eyes darkened. Did you see what was inside? No, Gina said, but I saw the name on the envelope. It was addressed to Louis. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Interesting. The door opened again and Juliet Belliver entered, her sharp gaze flicking between Miss Marple and Gina. Gina, Juliet said briskly, your husband's looking for you. Gina rose reluctantly. Thank you, Juliet. As Gina left the room, Juliet's gaze remained fixed on Miss Marple. You've been busy, she said coolly. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Observation is rarely wasted time. Juliet's eyes narrowed. And what have you observed? Miss Marple's expression remained calm. That in a house full of mirrors, the truth is often hidden behind the reflection. Juliet's lips tightened. You believe one of us killed Christian? I believe, Miss Marple said softly, that Christian discovered something dangerous, and someone acted to silence him. Juliet's gaze hardened. And you suspect Alex? Miss Marple's smile was faint. Alex was searching through Christian's briefcase last night. Juliet's jaw tightened. Alex always looks out for himself. Indeed, Miss Marple replied, but self-preservation can be a dangerous motive. Juliet hesitated for a moment longer, then turned sharply and left the room. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple walked through the gardens, her gaze drifting toward the stone path that led to the stables. The mist had lifted slightly, revealing the old brick structure at the edge of the property. Miss Marple stepped for a light as she crossed the grass, her shoes barely making a sound. She reached the stable doors and pushed them open slowly. Inside, the smell of hay and leather filled the air. Alex Rees-Derrick stood near the far wall, adjusting the saddle on a chestnut mare. He turned as Miss Marple entered. Miss Marple, he said smoothly, to what do I owe the pleasure? Miss Marple's smile was faint. I thought a walk might clear my thoughts. Alex's eyes glinted. And what thoughts would those be? Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Christian Gulbrinson's briefcase. Alex's smile tightened. Ah, I see Gina has been talking. Miss Marple stepped closer, her eyes never leaving his face. What was in the envelope, Mr. Reesterick? Alex's smile remained fixed. Nothing important. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Important enough for Christian to address it to Lewis? Alex's jaw tightened. You have a sharp mind, Miss Marple. Perhaps too sharp. Miss Marple's expression remained composed. I imagine Christian's letter contained information about the missing funds. Alex's eyes darkened. Possibly. Miss Marple's gaze remained steady. You realize that withholding evidence from the police is a crime? Alex's smile faded. And what if I'm protecting someone? Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Who are you protecting? Alex's gaze flicked toward the door. Perhaps you should ask Lewis. Miss Marple's brow lifted slightly. You believe Lewis was involved? Alex's smile returned, cold and thin. You're the one who said this house is full of deception. Perhaps you've been looking in the wrong place. Miss Marple studied him closely. Or perhaps I've been looking exactly where I need to. Alex's smile disappeared. Without another word, he turned and left the stable. Miss Marple stood for a moment longer, her eyes lingering on the empty doorway. Curious, she murmured. That evening, Miss Marple sat with Inspector Curry in the study. A small fire crackled on the hearth, casting flickering light across the dark wood paneling. So, Curry said, Reesterick took the letter? Miss Marple nodded. Yes, which raises an important question. Curry's eyes narrowed. What did Christian know? Miss Marple's gaze darkened. And more importantly, who wanted to keep him from revealing it? Curry's jaw tightened. We need to search Reesterick's room. Miss Marple's gaze remained thoughtful. Indeed, but I suspect we may find the answer not in what was taken, but in what remains hidden. Curry gave her a sharp look. You think this was misdirection? Miss Marple's smile was faint. I think we've been watching a performance, and someone has been controlling the stage. The study was dimly lit, the scent of leather and aged paper heavy in the air. Miss Marple sat near the fire, her knitting needles clicking softly as Inspector Curry paced before the hearth. His brow was furrowed, his hands clasped behind his back. So, Curry said, his tone sharp. Alex Reesterick had the letter addressed to Lewis. Miss Marple's gaze remained focused on her knitting. Yes, and yet, Curry continued, he claimed it contained nothing of importance. Miss Marple's lips curved faintly. Precisely. Curry stopped pacing. What are you thinking? Miss Marple's eyes lifted. That Alex is not the type to act without purpose. If he took the letter, it was because it contained something valuable, either to him or to someone else. Curry's gaze sharpened, and yet he didn't destroy it. Miss Marple's smile deepened. No, he kept it, which suggests he believed it could be used to his advantage. A knock at the door interrupted them. The butler, Weatherby, entered with his usual measured grace. Sir Lewis Serrocold requests to speak with you both, Weatherby said stiffly. Inspector Curry exchanged a glance with Miss Marple. Send him in. Weatherby stepped aside, and Lewis Serrocold entered the room. His tall figure seemed more stooped than usual, his thinning hair slightly disheveled. His eyes were red-rimmed behind his wire-rimmed glasses. Miss Marple. Inspector. His voice was thin. I'm sorry to trouble you. Not at all, Miss Marple said gently. Please, sit down. Lewis lowered himself into the chair opposite them. He twisted his hands together nervously. I've been thinking, he began, his voice faltering, about Christian's death. Inspector Curry leaned forward. What about it? Lewis hesitated. He came to Stonygates to see me. He said he had discovered irregularities in the financial reports for the trust. Missing funds. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. How much? Lewis's hands clenched together. A substantial amount. And he confronted you? Curry asked. Lewis nodded slowly. He told me he intended to report it to the board. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. And then he was murdered. Lewis's face twisted with anguish. You think I killed him? Inspector Curry's gaze darkened. Did you? No. Lewis's voice cracked. But I believe someone close to me may have. Miss Marple's brow lifted. Alex. Lewis's gaze faltered. Alex had access to the financial records. He knew Christian was asking questions. Curry's expression hardened. And yet, Alex is still walking free. Lewis's hands trembled because there's no proof. Miss Marple's gaze remained calm. Not yet. Lewis's eyes filled with quiet despair. If Alex killed Christian, it's my fault. I brought him into the trust. I trusted him. Miss Marple's gaze softened. Trust is a dangerous thing when placed in the wrong hands. Lewis's eyes filled with pain. He rose to his feet. I'm sorry. I need some air. He left the room, his footsteps fading down the hall. Inspector Curry sighed heavily. It fits, doesn't it? Alex had motive, opportunity, and means. Miss Marple's gaze remained thoughtful. Perhaps. Curry's brow furrowed. You're not convinced? Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. The trouble with mirrors, Inspector, is that they reflect not just reality, but also the illusion. Inspector Curry frowned. What are you suggesting? Miss Marple's smile was faint. That we may have been looking at a reflection of the truth, and not the truth itself. That evening, the drawing room was crowded with the usual residents of Stonygates. Mildred, Juliet Belliver, Alex Reesterick, Gina, and Stephen Reesterick sat in tense silence as Inspector Curry stood before the fireplace. Miss Marple sat at the edge of the room, her hands resting on her lap. I have a question, Miss Marple said, her voice cutting through the silence. All eyes turned toward her. Christian Gulbranson was killed because he had discovered something dangerous, she continued. The financial irregularities in the trust accounts. Alex Reesterick's gaze darkened. And you think I killed him? Miss Marple smiled faintly. No, I don't believe you killed him. Alex's brow lifted. Then who? Miss Marple's gaze slid toward Mildred. Mildred, Miss Marple said softly. Did you know about the financial discrepancies? Mildred's face paled. Of course not. Miss Marple's smile deepened. And yet Christian's letter was addressed to Lewis. Why not to the board directly? Mildred's gaze hardened. Because Lewis is the head of the trust. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Yes, but Christian trusted Lewis. And yet, he didn't give Lewis the letter in person. Why? Juliet Belliver's gaze darkened. Are you suggesting Lewis already knew? Miss Marple's gaze shifted toward Juliet. No, I am suggesting Christian knew Lewis was being deceived. Alex's expression darkened. By who? Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. By the person who had the most to lose and the most to gain. Mildred's eyes widened. You can't mean... Miss Marple's gaze settled on Juliet. Juliet. A sharp intake of breath followed. Juliet's expression remained calm. You're mistaken. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Christian's letter didn't just identify the missing funds. It identified the person who took them. Juliet's smile was thin. And you believe that's me? Miss Marple's voice remained steady. Yes. Juliet's gaze hardened. On what evidence? Miss Marple's smile was faint. Because of what you said to me the day after Christian's death. You said you were aware that Christian intended to speak to Lewis. But Christian never mentioned that to anyone, except the person he confronted. Juliet's expression darkened. Miss Marple continued. And then there's the matter of the gun. Alex's brow furrowed. The gun? Miss Marple's eyes glinted. The gun used to kill Christian was registered to the household. But it wasn't Lewis's. It was Juliet's. Juliet's face darkened. You can't prove that. Miss Marple's smile sharpened. Perhaps not. But the truth, dear Juliet, has a way of revealing itself in time. Juliet's eyes flashed with cold anger. You're very clever, Miss Marple. Miss Marple's expression remained calm. I've merely learned to see through the illusion. Juliet's gaze remained steady. Illusions can be dangerous, Miss Marple. Miss Marple's gaze was steady. Yes, especially when they shatter. The atmosphere in the drawing room was heavy with tension. Juliet Belliver's eyes were dark with suspicion, her expression cold and controlled. Alex Reesterick stood nearby, his arms crossed over his chest, his gaze fixed on the floor. Mildred sat rigidly in her chair, her hands clenched in her lap. Miss Marple's gaze remained steady as she addressed Juliet directly. "You seem remarkably calm," Miss Marple said softly. Juliet's brow lifted. "Should I be otherwise?" Miss Marple's smile was faint. "Most people would be disturbed to have their name linked to a murder." Juliet's expression didn't shift. "Perhaps that's because I have nothing to hide." Inspector Curry stepped forward, his gaze sharp. "You had access to the gun." Juliet's lips curved faintly, as did several others in this house. "And yet," Miss Marple said gently, "you were the one Christian confronted about the missing funds." Juliet's eyes narrowed. "That's a dangerous assumption." Miss Marple's gaze softened. "It's not an assumption. It's a conclusion based on the facts." Juliet's smile thinned. "And what facts are those?" Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly in her hands. Christian Gulbranson was a careful man. He wouldn't have spoken about financial discrepancies without proof. He found that proof in the trust accounts. Juliet's eyes remained dark. "And you believe I falsified those records?" Miss Marple's smile was faint. "It's more than a belief, Juliet. It's a certainty." Juliet's expression hardened. "And your evidence?" Miss Marple's eyes glinted. "The letter." Juliet's brow furrowed. "The letter Christian wrote to Lewis," Miss Marple continued. "It wasn't destroyed. Alex took it, but he didn't read it." Alex's head snapped up. "I didn't." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "No, he took it because he knew it was dangerous, but he didn't know why." Inspector Curry's gaze sharpened. "Where's the letter now?" Miss Marple's gaze settled on Juliet. "In Juliet's possession." Juliet's expression darkened. Miss Marple's voice softened. Christian's letter detailed the financial discrepancies, but it also named the person responsible. That's why he was killed, not because of the money, but because of what he knew. Juliet's eyes flashed coldly. "And you think I killed him to protect myself?" Miss Marple's smile was faint. "Yes." Juliet's gaze sharpened. "Prove it." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "You already have." Juliet's eyes narrowed. "How?" Miss Marple's gaze didn't waver. "When you spoke to me the day after Christian's death, you said you were aware that he intended to speak to Lewis. But Christian never mentioned that to anyone, except the person he confronted." Juliet's expression tightened. Miss Marple's tone remained calm. "And then there's the matter of the gun. It was registered to the household, but it wasn't Lewis's. It was yours." Juliet's eyes darkened. Inspector Curry's gaze hardened. "We'll need to search Juliet's room." Juliet's lips curled faintly. "You won't find anything." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "Perhaps not, but the truth, dear Juliet, has a way of revealing itself." Juliet's gaze turned cold. "You're very clever, Miss Marple." Miss Marple's smile was calm. "I've merely learned to see through the illusion." Juliet's gaze hardened. "Illusions can be dangerous, Miss Marple." Miss Marple's gaze remained steady. "Yes, especially when they shatter." Juliet's eyes flashed with cold anger. "You're overreaching." Miss Marple's smile softened. "We shall see." A heavy silence filled the room. Inspector Curry's voice was low. "We'll search the house. If we find the letter—" "You won't," Juliet said calmly. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "Because you destroyed it?" Juliet's smile was thin. "Perhaps." Inspector Curry's jaw tightened. "You realize that makes you look even more guilty." Juliet's gaze remained steady. "Does it?" Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. "The trouble with mirrors, Juliet, is that they reflect not just reality, but also the illusion." Juliet's eyes narrowed. Miss Marple's gaze softened. "And you've been very good at creating illusions." Juliet's expression remained calm. "We'll see how this plays out." Miss Marple's smile deepened. "Yes, we shall." The search of Juliet Bellyver's room began shortly after their tense exchange in the drawing room. Inspector Curry stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze sharp as two constables methodically examined the drawers, shelves, and wardrobe. Juliet sat on the edge of her bed, her expression calm and detached. Miss Marple stood quietly by the window, her hands working the knitting needles with delicate precision. One of the constables lifted a stack of papers from the writing desk, flipping through them quickly. "Nothing here, sir." Inspector Curry's gaze sharpened. "Keep looking." Juliet's lips curled faintly. "You're wasting your time." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Perhaps, but the truth has a way of hiding in plain sight." Juliet's gaze darkened. "Or not hiding at all." A constable opened a drawer and pulled out a small, leather-bound box. He handed it to Inspector Curry, who unfastened the clasp and opened it. Inside were a few pieces of jewelry: a pearl necklace, a silver bracelet, and a pair of diamond earrings. "Personal items," Curry muttered. Juliet's smile was faint. "Feel free to keep looking." The search continued. The constables emptied drawers, checked on the bed, and even removed the cushions from the armchair. After nearly half an hour, one of the constables sighed. "Nothing, sir." Inspector Curry's jaw tightened. His gaze turned toward Miss Marple. Perhaps the letter was destroyed after all. Miss Marple's gaze remained calm. "Perhaps." Juliet's smile deepened. "It seems you were mistaken, Miss Marple." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. "Mistaken, perhaps, but not wrong." Juliet's eyes narrowed. A delicate distinction. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "Yes, just like the distinction between misdirection and truth." Juliet's smile thinned. "You speak in riddles." Miss Marple's expression softened. "Not riddles. Patterns." Juliet's brow lifted. "Patterns?" Miss Marple nodded. "Human behavior is remarkably consistent. When someone is hiding something, they tend to focus attention elsewhere." Inspector Curry's gaze sharpened. "Are you suggesting the letter isn't hidden in Juliet's room?" Miss Marple's gaze softened. "No, I'm suggesting that it was never here to begin with." Juliet's eyes flashed. "What are you implying?" Miss Marple's knitting needles stilled. "That the letter was hidden in a place where no one would think to look." Inspector Curry's brow furrowed. "And where would that be?" Miss Marple's smile was faint. "Somewhere completely ordinary." Juliet's smile thinned. "Do tell." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "Lewis's study." Juliet's eyes darkened. Inspector Curry's gaze hardened. "Why would Juliet hide the letter in Lewis's study?" Miss Marple's knitting resumed. "Because Lewis's study was the last place anyone would suspect Juliet to search or to hide evidence." Juliet's lips parted. "You're reaching, Miss Marple." Miss Marple's eyes glinted. "Am I?" Inspector Curry's gaze sharpened. "It's worth a look." Juliet's expression tightened. "You'll find nothing." Miss Marple's smile softened. "Perhaps not, but if you'd like to accompany us." Juliet's gaze hardened. "I have no objection." Inspector Curry's voice was low. "Let's go." The group moved through the dark corridors of Stonygates, the echo of their footsteps magnified by the polished wood floors. The study was locked, but Inspector Curry produced a key and opened the door. The room was dark, lined with bookshelves and heavy furniture. The faint scent of old paper and leather filled the air. Miss Marple's gaze scanned the room thoughtfully. Her eyes settled on a large globe sitting on a mahogany side table near the window. She walked toward it slowly. Juliet's gaze followed her movements, sharp and tense. Miss Marple placed a delicate hand on the globe and turned it slightly. It clicked faintly as it rotated. Then, a soft sound of paper rustling. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Ah!" Inspector Curry's gaze sharpened. "What is it?" Miss Marple's hand reached beneath the base of the globe. Her fingers brushed against the edge of a folded piece of paper tucked into a hidden compartment. She pulled it free. Juliet's eyes narrowed dangerously. Inspector Curry stepped forward and took the letter from Miss Marple's hand. He unfolded it carefully, his gaze scanning the contents. His expression darkened. "Well?" Miss Marple asked softly. Inspector Curry's voice was cold. "It's Christian Gulbrinson's letter. He names Juliet Belliver as the one responsible for the missing funds." Juliet's expression remained calm. "Clever." Inspector Curry's gaze hardened. "Take her in." A constable stepped toward Juliet, but she didn't resist. Juliet's gaze met Miss Marple's. Her smile was faint, almost amused. "It seems I underestimated you." Miss Marple's expression softened. Yes, most people do. Juliet's smile lingered. It was worth the gamble. Miss Marple's gaze remained steady. Deception often is, but the truth has a way of winning in the end. Juliet's eyes darkened. We'll see. As the constable led Juliet from the room, Miss Marple's gaze followed her thoughtfully. Inspector Curry exhaled slowly. Impressive, Miss Marple. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. It's not impressive, just a matter of recognizing patterns. Inspector Curry's smile was faint. Still, nicely done. Miss Marple's gaze softened. Thank you. As the door closed behind them, Miss Marple's expression darkened. A quiet whisper of unease settled beneath her skin, because deception, she knew, was rarely that simple. Juliet Belliver had been escorted away in handcuffs. Inspector Curry had the letter in hand. Christian Gulbrinson's final words, naming Juliet as the one responsible for the misappropriation of funds at Stonygates. The case, it seemed, was closed. And yet, Miss Marple's mind was not at rest. She sat in the library later that evening, her knitting resting on her lap as the crackling of the fireplace filled the room. The house was quiet, too quiet, and the heavy sense of unease still hung in the air. Louis Serrocold entered the room, his expression heavy with weariness. Miss Marple. She looked up with a soft smile. Mr. Serrocold. Louis sat down across from her, his gaze fixed on the flickering flames. I suppose I should thank you. Miss Marple's gaze softened. There's no need. Louis's brow furrowed. It's over, isn't it? Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. I'm not sure. Louis's gaze sharpened. What do you mean? Miss Marple's eyes lifted, thoughtful and steady. Does it not seem strange to you, Mr. Serrocold, that Juliet would leave the letter hidden in such a careless place? Louis's expression darkened. She was desperate. Perhaps she panicked. Miss Marple's smile was faint. Perhaps. Louis's gaze narrowed. You think otherwise? Miss Marple's knitting needles slowed. Desperation makes people careless. But Juliet was not careless. She was precise. She was calculating. Louis's mouth tightened. So why would she leave the letter somewhere it could be so easily found? Miss Marple's smile deepened. Unless that's exactly what she intended. Louis's eyes sharpened. You think the letter was planted? Miss Marple's gaze softened. No, I think Juliet was meant to take the fall. Louis's breath sharpened. By whom? Miss Marple's knitting stilled. That, Mr. Serrocold, is the final piece of the puzzle. A shadow passed across Louis's face. If Juliet was not the one behind this, then who? A soft sound interrupted him. The quiet creak of a floorboard behind them. Miss Marple's gaze lifted toward the doorway. Alexis Rees-Sterrick stood in the shadowed threshold. His expression was smooth, too smooth, but his eyes were sharp and cold. Miss Marple, he said softly. Louis's gaze sharpened. Alexis's smile was faint. It's been a long day. Miss Marple's eyes remained steady. Yes, it has. Alexis stepped forward, his gaze fixed on Miss Marple. I hear Juliet was taken into custody. Louis's jaw tightened. She was. Alexis's smile thinned. Convenient. Miss Marple's brow lifted. For whom? Alexis's smile didn't change. For all of us. Miss Marple's knitting resumed. Unless, of course, Juliet was innocent. Alexis's gaze darkened. That's unlikely, isn't it? Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Is it? Alexis's smile faded. Louis's gaze hardened. What are you implying? Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. Juliet was certainly capable of deception, but she was not the one pulling the strings. Alexis's expression cooled. You sound very certain. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. I am. Alexis's eyes glittered dangerously. And why is that? Miss Marple's knitting stilled. Because Christian Gulbrinson knew who was responsible, and he trusted Juliet. Alexis's smile sharpened. Trusted her enough to write her name in a letter? Miss Marple's gaze darkened. Or perhaps he wrote her name to protect someone else. Louis's eyes widened. Protect whom? Miss Marple's gaze settled on Alexis, someone close enough to Christian to know his habits, someone clever enough to forge a letter and make it look convincing, someone who would benefit from Juliet taking the blame. Alexis's smile faded completely. Miss Marple's voice was soft. "You, Mr. Reese-Derrick." Lewis's breath caught. "What?" Alexis's gaze sharpened. "That's absurd." Miss Marple's smile was faint. "Is it?" Alexis's jaw tightened. "What possible motive would I have?" Miss Marple's gaze didn't waver. Control. Alexis's expression darkened. Miss Marple's voice remained calm. "You were deeply invested in Stonygates, financially and emotionally. When Christian discovered the misappropriation of funds, you knew he would put an end to it. That would have destroyed your influence and your future." Alexis's smile returned, thin and cold. "An interesting theory." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "And when Christian confronted you, you acted swiftly. You shot him, and staged it to look like Juliet was responsible." Alexis's gaze cooled. "Can you prove that?" Miss Marple's smile softened. "You made one mistake." Alexis's expression darkened. "And what mistake was that?" Miss Marple's eyes glinted. "The letter. Christian would never have written Juliet's name. He would have confronted her directly, not written it down, but he would have written your name." Alexis's gaze sharpened. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked. "Unless, of course, you forged it." Inspector Curry's voice cut through the tension. "That's enough." Alexis's gaze shifted. Inspector Curry stood in the doorway with two constables at his back. Curry's gaze was cold. "We recovered fragments of a second letter, burned, in the fireplace of Alexis's room." Alexis's smile thinned. "Circumstantial." Inspector Curry's voice sharpened. "Perhaps, but the handwriting analysis matches your hand." Alexis's expression hardened. Miss Marple's smile deepened. "It seems the truth does have a way of surfacing." Alexis's gaze sharpened. Then, slowly, his smile returned. "Well played, Miss Marple." Inspector Curry's voice was cold. "Take him." Alexis didn't resist as the constable stepped forward. His gaze lingered on Miss Marple. "I underestimated you." Miss Marple's expression softened. "Yes, most people do." As Alexis was led from the room, Lewis's expression was heavy with disbelief. "How did you know?" Miss Marple's gaze softened. "Patterns, Mr. Serocold. People rarely change their patterns." Lewis's gaze darkened. "And Juliet?" Miss Marple's voice was quiet. "Juliet was guilty of many things, but not murder." Lewis's breath tightened. "She was set up." Miss Marple's smile softened. "Yes." Lewis's voice was low. "You saved her." Miss Marple's knitting resumed. She was simply fortunate that the truth was willing to be found. Lewis's gaze softened. "You've done it again, Miss Marple." Miss Marple's smile deepened. "Yes, but then, that's what I'm here for." The following morning, Stonygates was unusually quiet. The weight of the previous night's events still hung over the house like a heavy fog. Miss Marple sat in the morning room, a delicate cup of tea resting between her hands. Her knitting lay beside her on the table, unfinished for the first time in days. Lewis Serocold entered the room quietly. His expression was drawn, his shoulders slightly hunched. He hesitated at the threshold, then stepped forward. "Miss Marple." She looked up with a warm smile. "Mr. Serocold." Lewis's gaze was heavy. "I don't know how to thank you." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "There's no need for thanks." Lewis sat down across from her. His hands rested on his knees, his gaze fixed on the floor. "I keep thinking about what might have happened if you hadn't been here." Miss Marple's smile was faint. "But I was—" Lewis's mouth tightened. "Still, Alexis." His voice darkened. "I trusted him." Miss Marple's eyes were kind. Trust is a dangerous thing when placed in the wrong hands. Lewis's gaze sharpened. "Did you suspect him from the beginning?" Miss Marple's smile softened. "No, but I watched and listened. People reveal themselves in small ways, in the way they speak, the way they move." Lewis's brow furrowed. "What gave him away?" Miss Marple's eyes darkened. He was too controlled. Lewis's gaze sharpened. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. Deception is a delicate game. Most people give themselves away through nerves or haste, but Alexis was too smooth, too prepared. Lewis's expression hardened. And Juliet? Miss Marple's voice was soft. Juliet was not innocent, but she was not a murderer. Alexis exploited her weaknesses, her desperation. He knew that once Christian discovered the truth, Juliet would become a target of suspicion, and he used that to shield himself. Lewis's gaze darkened. He nearly got away with it. Miss Marple's smile was faint. Yes, but even the cleverest criminal cannot control every detail. Lewis's breath sharpened. And the letter? Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. That was his mistake. Lewis's brow furrowed. Miss Marple's voice softened. Christian Gulbranson was a precise man, methodical. He would never have written Juliet's name in that manner unless he was under extreme duress. Lewis's eyes narrowed. Alexis forged it? Miss Marple's gaze darkened. Yes, and he planted it where it would be found. Because he knew that once suspicion was placed on Juliet, the investigation would stop there. Lewis's expression hardened, and Alexis would walk away clean. Miss Marple's eyes glinted, except he underestimated human nature. Lewis's brow furrowed. How so? Miss Marple's smile deepened. Guilt is a difficult thing to conceal. Alexis knew how to manipulate facts, but he could not hide the weight of his own actions. His control was too perfect, and that is what betrayed him. Lewis's expression softened. You see more than most people. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. I have had many years of practice. A soft knock at the door interrupted them. Gina stepped into the room, her expression guarded. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, her gaze shadowed. Miss Marple. Miss Marple's gaze softened. Gina, dear. Gina's lips parted, but no words came. Her hands trembled. Miss Marple's gaze steadied. Come and sit down. Gina hesitated, then crossed the room and sat beside Miss Marple. I don't understand, Gina whispered. Alexis, I trusted him. I loved him. Miss Marple's expression softened. Love can blind us to many things. Gina's eyes filled with tears. Did he ever love me? Miss Marple's gaze softened. In his way, perhaps. But Alexis was a man consumed by control and power. That kind of love is rarely gentle. Gina's breath hitched. I feel so foolish. Miss Marple reached out and covered Gina's hand with her own. You are not foolish, my dear. You are young, and you trusted someone who did not deserve it. Gina's eyes darkened. How did you know? Miss Marple's smile was soft. Patterns, my dear. People rarely change their patterns. Gina's gaze sharpened. And Alexis? Miss Marple's smile deepened. His pattern was control, and control leaves a trace. Gina's breath was unsteady. What happens now? Lewis's voice was low. The police have enough evidence to prosecute Alexis. He'll be charged with murder and fraud. Gina's expression tightened. And Juliet? Miss Marple's gaze softened. Juliet will face consequences, but not for murder. Gina's eyes darkened. She's not innocent. Miss Marple's gaze was steady. No, but her role in this was one of weakness, not malice. And weakness, my dear, can sometimes be forgiven. Gina's breath steadied. Lewis's gaze softened. And Stonygates. Miss Marple's expression deepened. That will be up to you. Lewis's brow furrowed. Me! Miss Marple's smile softened. The damage Alexis inflicted will not disappear overnight, but Stonygates can still be a place of healing, if you wish it to be. Lewis's expression darkened. And Juliet? Miss Marple's gaze softened. That will be her decision to make. Lewis's breath steadied. You think she can change? Miss Marple's eyes were warm. People are capable of many things, Mr. Serocold. Even redemption. Gina's gaze steadied. And Alexis? Miss Marple's smile faded. Justice will take its course. Lewis's gaze darkened. And you? Miss Marple's smile deepened. I will return home. Gina's breath caught. So soon? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. My roses will be missing me. Lewis's smile softened. You've done more for us than we can ever repay. Miss Marple's gaze softened. No repayment is necessary. Gina's hand tightened around Miss Marple's. Thank you. Miss Marple's smile deepened. It's what I do, my dear. As the morning light filled the room, Miss Marple's gaze settled on the garden beyond the window. Order had been restored. But as she sipped her tea, Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Because in the quiet shadows of Stonygates, she knew not all secrets had been uncovered. Later that afternoon, the house at Stonygates felt strangely still. The police had come and gone. Alexis's arrest had cast a long shadow over the household. But there was also a quiet sense of relief, as if the weight of his presence had been lifted. Miss Marple sat in the library, her knitting resting on her lap. The room was dim, the heavy curtains drawn back just enough to let the gray afternoon light filter through. She had spent much of the morning answering questions from the police, but her mind remained unsettled. Something was still not right. She heard a soft knock at the door. Come in. Gina stepped into the room, her expression drawn. Miss Marple? Miss Marple's eyes softened. Come and sit down, my dear. Gina hesitated, then crossed the room and sank into the armchair opposite Miss Marple. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, her knuckles pale. I can't stop thinking about it, Gina whispered. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. About Alexis? Gina's lips parted, but then she hesitated. No, about Christian. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. What about Christian? Gina's eyes darkened. Something doesn't make sense. Miss Marple's gaze steadied. Go on. Gina's breath hitched. Why was Christian so certain that Juliet was involved? Miss Marple's expression tightened. That's an excellent question. Gina's brow furrowed. Christian was precise. Careful. Why would he accuse Juliet unless he was absolutely certain? Miss Marple's eyes darkened. Unless someone led him to that conclusion. Gina's breath sharpened. Alexis? Miss Marple's smile was faint. That is the simplest answer, but not necessarily the correct one. Gina's gaze sharpened. What do you mean? Miss Marple's knitting needles stilled. Juliet was involved, but not in the way Alexis intended. Gina's brow furrowed. Miss Marple's gaze darkened. Alexis planned to frame Juliet, but Christian Gulbranson knew too much. He suspected Alexis, but he also knew that Juliet was hiding something. Gina's breath hitched. What was she hiding? Miss Marple's gaze softened. That is the question. Gina's hands twisted in her lap. You think Juliet was protecting someone? Miss Marple's smile was faint. Perhaps. Gina's eyes darkened. But who? Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. That, my dear, is what we must discover. A soft sound at the door made them both turn. Louis Serocold stood in the doorway. His gaze shadowed. His expression was controlled. But Miss Marple saw the tension beneath the surface. Miss Marple, Louis said softly, there's something you need to see. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. What is it? Louis's mouth tightened. A letter. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. From whom? Louis's expression darkened. From Christian Gulbranson. Gina's breath caught. But Christian is dead. Louis's gaze was grim. The letter was addressed to me. It arrived this morning, but the staff didn't deliver it until after the police left. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. May I see it? Louis stepped forward and handed her the letter. The envelope was cream-colored, the handwriting precise and formal. Miss Marple's fingers trembled slightly as she unfolded the paper. Her gaze sharpened as she read. Louis, I fear I have stumbled upon something dangerous. Juliet knows more than she is saying. There is a secret within these walls, one that could cost us all dearly. I cannot say more in writing, but I must speak with you urgently. Please, trust no one, not even those closest to you. Christian, Miss Marple's breath steadied. Gina's eyes widened. He knew. Louis's expression tightened. Yes. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. And now we know that Juliet holds a key. Gina's mouth tightened. But if Juliet isn't working with Alexis, Miss Marple's gaze darkened. Then she is protecting someone else. Gina's eyes narrowed. But who? Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. That is the question. A soft knock at the door interrupted them. Juliet stood in the doorway. Her expression was calm. Too calm. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Juliet's smile was faint. I hope I'm not interrupting. Louis's mouth tightened. Not at all. Juliet's gaze darkened. I heard about the letter. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. Did you? Juliet's smile was controlled. I imagine Christian's final words were quite revealing. Miss Marple's gaze deepened. They were. Juliet's mouth curved. And now you think you have all the answers. Miss Marple's smile was faint. Not all the answers. Juliet's gaze sharpened. Then perhaps I can help. Miss Marple's gaze steadied. Perhaps you can. Juliet's eyes darkened. But you may not like what you discover. Miss Marple's smile deepened. Truth, my dear, is rarely comfortable. Juliet's expression sharpened. Then her smile faded. I suppose we'll find out, Juliet said softly. Miss Marple's gaze was calm. Yes, we will. As Juliet turned and left the room, Gina's breath hitched. Miss Marple, Gina whispered. She knows something. Miss Marple's gaze darkened. Yes, my dear. Louis's expression tightened. But what is she hiding? Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. That is what we must discover. Miss Marple sat in the library long after Juliet had left. The letter from Christian Gulbinson lay open on the side table. The words etched in her mind. Trust no one. Louis and Gina had left to speak with the police, but Miss Marple had remained behind. Her knitting needles clicked softly in the silence. Outside, the late afternoon sunlight had faded into dusk, casting long shadows across the polished floor. She was troubled. Alexis had been arrested. But the pieces of the puzzle didn't quite fit. Alexis had tried to frame Juliet. That much was clear. But why? What had Christian discovered that had made him a target? And why had Juliet been protecting him? A soft creak at the door drew her from her thoughts. Carrie Louise entered the room. Her expression was calm, but her eyes were clouded with quiet concern. Jane, Carrie Louise said softly, I'm worried about Juliet. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. What about her? Carrie Louise sank into the armchair opposite Miss Marple. Her hands were trembling slightly as she smoothed the folds of her skirt. She's changed, Carrie Louise said. Since Christian's death. She's withdrawn, guarded. Miss Marple's gaze softened. Perhaps because she knows more than she's saying. Carrie Louise's brow furrowed. You don't think Juliet had anything to do with Christian's death? Miss Marple's knitting needles stilled. No, my dear, but I do believe she knows who did. Carrie Louise's breath hitched. But why would you protect them? Miss Marple's gaze darkened. That is the question. Carrie Louise's hands twisted in her lap. Louis believes Juliet was working with Alexis. Miss Marple's expression was calm. Louis is mistaken. Carrie Louise's eyes widened. Then who? The door creaked open. Juliet stood in the doorway. Her expression shadowed. I'm interrupting, Juliet said softly. Carrie Louise's gaze sharpened. No, dear. Juliet's gaze flicked toward Miss Marple. I need to speak with you. Miss Marple's smile was faint. Of course. Carrie Louise hesitated, then rose to her feet. I'll leave you both. As Carrie Louise left the room, Juliet crossed toward the window. The fading twilight cast long shadows across her face. Miss Marple's gaze steadied. What is it, my dear? Juliet's breath hitched. I want to tell you the truth. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. I'm listening. Juliet's hands tightened around the back of the armchair. Christian came to me the night before he died. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. And Juliet's eyes darkened. He asked me about Alexis. Miss Marple's breath steadied. What did he ask? Juliet's expression tightened. He wanted to know if Alexis had ever mentioned Louis. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Louis. Juliet's lips parted, but then she hesitated. Yes. Miss Marple's gaze deepened. Go on. Juliet's breath hitched. I told Christian that Alexis and Louis barely spoke, but Christian didn't believe me. Miss Marple's brow furrowed. Why? Juliet's gaze darkened. Because Christian had seen Alexis and Louis arguing. Miss Marple's breath sharpened. Juliet's expression tightened. Christian believed that Louis was hiding something. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Did Alexis confront Louis? Juliet's breath steadied. Yes. Miss Marple's gaze darkened. And Juliet's expression sharpened. Louis denied everything. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. What did Christian suspect? Juliet's gaze hardened. That Louis knew more about Alexis's business dealings than he admitted. Miss Marple's breath steadied. And you believe Christian was killed because of this? Juliet's gaze sharpened. I believe Christian got too close to the truth. Miss Marple's gaze deepened. And Alexis killed him? Juliet's breath sharpened. No. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Then who? Juliet's lips parted, but then she hesitated. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Juliet. Juliet's breath hitched. Louis. Miss Marple's breath sharpened. You believe Louis was involved? Juliet's expression tightened. I don't know. Miss Marple's gaze darkened. But you suspect it. Juliet's mouth tightened. Yes. Miss Marple's gaze steadied. Why didn't you tell the police? Juliet's eyes darkened. Because I didn't want to believe it. Miss Marple's gaze deepened. And now? Juliet's breath sharpened. Now I'm afraid I was right. Miss Marple's gaze steadied. Juliet, if Louis was involved. Juliet's breath hitched. Then Christian's death wasn't just a crime of opportunity. Miss Marple's eyes darkened. It was a cover-up. Juliet's breath sharpened. A soft knock at the door interrupted them. Louis stepped into the room, his expression shadowed. His gaze settled on Juliet. Juliet, Louis said softly, I need to speak with you. Juliet's breath hitched. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Louis, is something wrong? Louis's smile was faint. Nothing you need to worry about. Miss Marple's gaze deepened. Are you sure? Louis's gaze sharpened. Absolutely. Juliet's expression tightened. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. Louis's smile faded. I'll speak with you later. As Louis turned and left the room, Juliet's breath sharpened. Miss Marple's gaze darkened. Juliet. Juliet's eyes widened. Miss Marple's expression sharpened. We need to be very careful. Juliet's breath steadied. Why? Miss Marple's gaze hardened. Because the real danger is still inside this house. Miss Marple sat motionless after Louis left the room. Juliet's breath was still uneven, her eyes fixed on the closed door. The weight of the revelation hung heavy between them. Juliet turned toward Miss Marple, her hands tightening around the back of the chair. Jane, she whispered, if Louis was involved in Christian's death, what do we do? Miss Marple's gaze steadied. We need proof. Juliet's breath hitched. Proof. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. Suspicion is not enough. We need evidence. Juliet's gaze darkened. And if Louis knows we suspect him? Miss Marple's expression sharpened. Then we'll be in very real danger. A sudden knock at the door interrupted them. Juliet's breath sharpened as the door creaked open. Alex Reesterick stepped inside, his brow furrowed. His gaze swept the room before settling on Juliet. Juliet, Alex said softly, I need to speak with you. Juliet's expression hardened. What is it? Alex's gaze flicked toward Miss Marple. Privately. Juliet's jaw tightened. If it concerns Christian's death, it concerns all of us. Alex's breath steadied. His gaze darkened. Very well. Miss Marple's knitting needles stilled. What have you discovered? Alex's gaze sharpened. I've been going through Christian's papers. Miss Marple's expression deepened. And Alex hesitated. Christian had been investigating financial irregularities at the foundation. Juliet's breath hitched. Financial irregularities? Alex's expression tightened. Yes. Large sums of money were being moved to the foundation's accounts. Untraceable transactions. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. And you believe Louis was behind this? Alex's expression darkened. It's more than that. Juliet's eyes widened. What do you mean? Alex's breath steadied. Christian had traced the transactions to an offshore account, registered under Lewis's name. Miss Marple's gaze deepened, and Christian confronted him. Alex nodded. Yes, the night before he was killed. Juliet's breath sharpened. And Lewis denied it? Alex's expression tightened. No, Christian never gave Lewis the chance to deny it. Miss Marple's brow furrowed. What do you mean? Alex's gaze darkened. Christian left a letter for the police. A sealed letter, naming Lewis as the one behind financial discrepancies. Juliet's breath hitched. Where's the letter? Alex's jaw tightened. Gone. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Gone. Alex's breath darkened. Someone took it from Christian's study the night he was killed. Juliet's eyes widened. And you believe Lewis took it? Alex's expression darkened. Yes. Miss Marple's gaze deepened. If Lewis was stealing from the foundation and Christian discovered it, then Christian's death was not just a crime of opportunity. Alex's gaze sharpened. It was a cover-up. Juliet's breath hitched. But why involve Alexis? Alex's jaw tightened. Because Alexis was a perfect scapegoat. His criminal past, his instability. Lewis knew the police would suspect him. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. And Alexis's attempt to frame Juliet? Alex's breath steadied. Perhaps Alexis realized he had been used. Perhaps he was trying to protect himself. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. Or perhaps Alexis knew too much. Juliet's breath darkened, and Lewis silenced him. Alex's gaze sharpened, or tried to. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Alex, why are you telling us this now? Alex's breath steadied. Because I believe Lewis is dangerous. Miss Marple's gaze darkened. And you're afraid he's not finished. Alex's gaze sharpened. Yes. Juliet's breath hitched. What do we do? Miss Marple's gaze steadied. We need to draw Lewis out. Alex's breath sharpened. How? Miss Marple's smile was faint. By giving him exactly what he wants. Juliet's eyes widened. You mean? Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. If Lewis believed the evidence against him is still out there, he'll try to retrieve it. Alex's expression darkened. And when he does? Miss Marple's gaze hardened. We'll be waiting. Juliet's breath sharpened. Jane, this is dangerous. Miss Marple's smile was calm. Yes, my dear. Juliet's gaze darkened. But what if Lewis becomes desperate? Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Then we must be very careful. Alex's jaw tightened. When do we begin? Miss Marple's knitting needles stilled. Tonight. Juliet's breath sharpened. What's the plan? Miss Marple's gaze steadied. We'll stage a discovery. Let Lewis believe that Christian's letter has been found. Alex's gaze narrowed. And when he comes for it? Miss Marple's gaze darkened. We'll catch him in the act. Juliet's breath hitched. And if we're wrong? Miss Marple's expression deepened. We're not wrong. Alex's gaze sharpened. And if Lewis becomes violent? Miss Marple's smile was faint. Then we'll have to be very careful indeed. The house was unusually quiet that evening. The long shadows of dusk stretched across the hallways of Stonygates, casting an unsettling gloom over the heavy oak furniture and faded carpets. Miss Marple, Juliet, and Alex sat together in the library, finalizing the details of their plan. Juliet's hands trembled slightly as she poured herself a glass of sherry. Are we certain this will work? Miss Marple's gaze remained calm. If Lewis believes that Christian's letter has resurfaced, he will come for it. Alex's jaw tightened. And if he knows it's a trap? Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. Then we'll know just how dangerous he truly is. Juliet's breath hitched. How exactly are we going to convince Lewis that the letter has been found? Miss Marple smiled faintly. We'll leave breadcrumbs. Enough to draw him out. Alex leaned forward. Breadcrumbs. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. A mention of a letter in front of Lewis. A suggestion that it was found in Christian's study, tucked away in a forgotten drawer. Juliet's eyes darkened. And if Lewis takes a bait? Miss Marple's gaze deepened. Then we'll follow him. Alex's expression hardened. And if he realizes what we're doing? Miss Marple's smile was faint. We'll have to hope he doesn't. Juliet's breath quickened. Where will the letter be? Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. In Christian study. Alex's jaw tightened. We're leaving it there? Miss Marple's smile was faint. Not quite. Juliet's brow furrowed. What do you mean? Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. We'll leave a decoy. A letter sealed with Christian's handwriting. Enough to make Louis think he's retrieving the real thing. Alex's gaze darkened. And when he tries to take it? Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. We'll be waiting. Juliet's breath darkened. And if he panics? Miss Marple's smile was thin. Then we'll know he's guilty. Alex's gaze darkened. And if he's not guilty? Miss Marple's expression remained steady. He is. Alex hesitated. And if he's armed? Miss Marple's smile didn't fade. I imagine Louis is too clever to resort to violence unless he feels he has no choice. Juliet's breath quickened. And if he does feel he has no choice? Miss Marple's gaze darkened. Then we'll have to make certain he doesn't get that far. Alex's jaw tightened. Who's going to be in the study? Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. Juliet and I. Juliet's breath hitched. You want me there? Miss Marple's gaze steadied. If Louis believes you have the letter, he'll come to you. Juliet's expression darkened. But what if he... Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. That's why Alex will be waiting outside. Alex's jaw tightened. And if Louis doesn't take the bait? Miss Marple's smile was faint. Then we try again. Juliet's breath darkened. And if Louis suspects us? Miss Marple's expression sharpened. Then we'll be in trouble. Alex's gaze darkened. And if he succeeds in taking the letter? Miss Marple's smile was faint. Then we'll let him. Juliet's breath sharpened. Let him? Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. It's not the letter that matters. It's the fact that he's trying to take it. Alex's gaze narrowed. You mean? Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. We need to catch him in the act. Juliet's breath darkened. And if Louis realizes it's a setup? Miss Marple's smile didn't fade. Then we'll know for certain. Alex's jaw tightened. And if Louis becomes desperate? Miss Marple's gaze deepened. That's why Alex will be waiting with the police. Juliet's breath hitched. You've already contacted police? Miss Marple's smile was faint. Inspector Curry has been notified. Alex's gaze sharpened. And if Louis doesn't fall for it? Miss Marple's knitting needles stilled. He will. Juliet's expression darkened. And if he gets violent? Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Then we'll have to be very, very careful. Alex's breath steadied. When do we begin? Miss Marple's gaze darkened. Tonight. Juliet's breath sharpened. And if Louis comes armed? Miss Marple's smile was calm. Then we'll be ready. Midnight. The house was eerily silent. Outside the window of Christian study, the moonlight glinted off the frost-covered lawn, casting long silver beams across the polished wood floor. The decoy letter sat neatly on the desk, sealed with Christian's unmistakable handwriting. Miss Marple and Juliet stood near the far wall, hidden partially in the shadows. Juliet's hands were trembling, but Miss Marple's expression was as calm and focused as ever. Are you sure he'll come? Juliet whispered, her breath visible in the cold night air. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. He's already here. Juliet stiffened. How do you know? Miss Marple's eyes narrowed toward the window. A shadow moved just beyond the glass. A soft creak of the floorboards outside the study door followed. He's careful, Miss Marple whispered, but not careful enough. Juliet's breath quickened. Should we? Miss Marple held up a hand. Wait. The door handle turned. Slowly. Carefully. Juliet's hand tightened on Miss Marple's arm. The door creaked open, revealing a figure dressed in dark clothing. Louis Serrocold stepped into the room, his face partially obscured by the low light. His gaze swept over the room and settled on the letter resting on the desk. Juliet's breath hitched. It's him. Miss Marple's gaze darkened. Of course it is. Louis moved toward the desk, his steps unnaturally quiet. His hand reached toward the letter, hesitating for a moment before his fingers closed around it. That's quite bold of you, Mr. Serocold. Miss Marple's voice cut through the silence like a blade. Lewis's hand froze. His gaze snapped toward the shadows where Miss Marple and Juliet stood. His expression darkened. Miss Marple. Miss Marple stepped forward, the dim light catching the sharp lines of her face. Planning on reading Christian's final words? Lewis's expression remained impassive. It's just a letter. I was curious. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Curiosity can be a dangerous thing. Lewis's smile was faint, or a necessary one. Juliet's breath quickened. You knew about Christian's letter all along, didn't you? Lewis's gaze darkened. I knew there might be complications. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. Complications? Lewis's jaw tightened. Christian knew too much. Juliet's eyes widened. You mean he? Lewis's expression darkened. He was going to ruin everything. Miss Marple's gaze deepened. Ruin what exactly? Lewis's smile thinned. You already know. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. Let's pretend I don't. Lewis's gaze darkened. Christian had uncovered discrepancies. In the accounts. The foundation's finances. Juliet's breath hitched. You mean theft? Lewis's smile faded. Creative accounting. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. And Christian was going to expose you? Lewis's gaze darkened. He was going to destroy the work we've done here. Juliet's breath sharpened. So you killed him? Lewis's expression remained cold. It was necessary. Miss Marple's gaze darkened. You poisoned him. Lewis's smile returned. He made it easy. Juliet's breath hitched. But why try to steal the letter now? Lewis's gaze narrowed. Because that letter could unravel everything. Miss Marple's gaze deepened. It's not the letter that matters. Lewis's smile thinned. No. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. It's the fact that you were willing to kill for it. Lewis's hand curled over the letter. And what do you intend to do about that? Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. It's already done. Lewis's gaze darkened. What do you mean? Behind Lewis, the study door opened. Inspector Curry stepped into the room, his gaze cold and hard. Two officers followed, their expressions tense. Lewis's expression shifted from control to sudden realization. You set me up. Miss Marple's smile was faint. Of course. Lewis's hand slipped toward his pocket. Inspector Curry's voice was sharp. Don't. Lewis's hand froze. The officers stepped forward. Lewis's gaze darkened. You won't be able to prove anything. Miss Marple's smile remained steady. You've already proven it yourself. Lewis's gaze hardened. His hand twitched toward his pocket. Inspector Curry's hand dropped to his sidearm. Don't. Lewis's jaw tightened. You don't understand. Miss Marple's gaze darkened. Oh, I understand perfectly. Lewis's breath sharpened. His gaze flicked toward the door. The tension in the room sharpened. And then, Lewis's hand darted toward his pocket. Inspector Curry's voice was sharp. Stop. The officers surged forward. Lewis's hand closed around something. Juliet screamed. Miss Marple remained calm. The officers wrestled Lewis to the ground. The object fell from his hand and clattered across the floor. A silver letter opener. Lewis's breath darkened. His gaze sharpened toward Miss Marple. Miss Marple's gaze was steady. You were never going to get away with it, Lewis. Inspector Curry straightened, his gaze dark. Take him. Lewis's breath sharpened as the officers lifted him to his feet. Lewis's gaze settled on Miss Marple. His smile was faint. You're more dangerous than you look. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. Yes. Lewis's smile faded as the officers dragged him from the room. Juliet's breath was still unsteady. It's over. Miss Marple's gaze softened. Nearly. Juliet's eyes widened. What do you mean? Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. We still have to find out who helped him. Juliet's breath darkened. You think there's someone else? Miss Marple's smile was faint. Of course. The heavy oak doors of the great hall swung closed with a hollow thud. Lewis Serocold's footsteps faded down the corridor as the officers escorted him away. Inspector Curry stood with arms crossed near the fireplace, his gaze cold and calculating. Miss Marple sat in a high-backed chair, her knitting resting on her lap. Juliet stood near the window, arms wrapped around herself, her expression still tense. Juliet's voice was thin. I don't understand. If Lewis was the one behind it all, why did Christian have to die? Miss Marple's eyes softened. Because Christian saw something he wasn't supposed to. Inspector Curry's gaze darkened, and Lewis couldn't afford to let that information get out. Juliet's expression twisted. But how did Lewis know Christian had discovered the truth? Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Because someone told him. Juliet's breath hitched. You mean? Lewis had helped. Inspector Curry's gaze darkened. That would explain a lot. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. Indeed. Juliet's eyes widened. But who? Miss Marple's gaze sharpened toward the far end of the hall. The heavy drapes fluttered slightly in the evening breeze, casting shifting shadows against the wall. The fire crackled low in the hearth. Outside, the wind whispered against the windows. Miss Marple's voice was calm. Someone close to Christian. Someone with access to his papers. His schedule. His private thoughts. Juliet's gaze sharpened. You mean someone in the house? Miss Marple's gaze remained steady. Exactly. Juliet's breath hitched. But who? Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked once more. We shall see. Inspector Curry's gaze narrowed. Do you have a suspect? Miss Marple's smile was faint. I have a theory. Inspector Curry's brow furrowed. And what's that? Miss Marple's gaze darkened. Lewis was clever. But the person who helped him, they're even cleverer. Juliet's breath quickened. But how do we catch them? Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. We set a trap. Inspector Curry's eyes narrowed. And how do you propose we do that? Miss Marple's smile remained faint. We use the one thing they're afraid of. Juliet's eyes widened. What's that? Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. The truth. The great hall was dimly lit by the flicker of the firelight. The shadows stretched long and dark across the polished wood floors. Outside, the wind howled softly against the windows. Miss Marple sat alone at the writing desk, a single piece of paper resting beneath her hands. She picked up a fountain pen and began writing with careful precision. Footsteps echoed in the hallway beyond the door. Slow, measured, Miss Marple's hand remained steady as the door creaked open. A figure stepped inside. Miss Marple's gaze remained on the paper. I wondered how long it would take you. The door closed softly behind the figure. You're clever, Miss Marple. Miss Marple's gaze lifted. Gina Hudd stood near the fireplace, her expression calm and composed. Her blonde hair was swept back from her face, her blue eyes glinting with quiet confidence. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Gina smiled faintly. You're very observant. Miss Marple's gaze darkened. Not observant enough, it seems. Gina's smile remained cool. Oh, I wouldn't say that. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly in her lap. You helped Lewis. Gina's gaze sharpened. You make it sound so vulgar. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Christian trusted you. Gina's smile darkened. Christian was weak. He was standing in the way of progress. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. And Lewis promised you what? Gina's smile thinned. Control. Juliet's breath hitched from the corner of the room. Control over what? Gina's gaze darkened. The foundation. The estate. Lewis had the mind for it, but I had the vision. Inspector Curry stepped forward from the shadows near the fireplace. And what was your plan? Gina's gaze sharpened. We were going to make the estate profitable again. Restructure the accounts. Expand our influence. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. At the expense of those you were supposed to protect. Gina's smile remained steady. Some losses are necessary. Juliet's voice sharpened. You killed Christian. Gina's gaze darkened. Lewis killed Christian. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. On your instruction. Gina's smile darkened. Christian was a liability. Inspector Curry's gaze hardened. And the others? Gina's gaze sharpened. What others? Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Alexis? Gina's gaze darkened. That was unfortunate. Juliet's breath quickened. You're a monster. Gina's smile thinned. I'm a realist. Inspector Curry's gaze hardened. And what were you planning to do once Lewis was arrested? Gina's smile darkened. Blame him, of course. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked once more. But you didn't count on one thing. Gina's gaze sharpened. And what's that? Miss Marple's smile was faint. Lewis's arrogance. Gina's gaze darkened. What do you mean? Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. He told me everything. Gina's expression darkened. He wouldn't. Miss Marple's smile deepened. But he did. Gina's breath sharpened. Inspector Curry's voice was cold. It's over, Gina. Gina's gaze darkened. No. Inspector Curry's hand dropped toward his sidearm. Don't. Gina's hand slipped into her pocket. Juliet's voice sharpened. She's armed. Inspector Curry's voice was sharp. Don't move. Gina's gaze hardened. Her hand tightened. Miss Marple's gaze remained steady. Gina's breath sharpened. And then, Gina's hand shot forward. Inspector Curry surged forward. Juliet screamed. A loud crash. Gina's hand hit the floor. A silver letter opener lay at her feet. Inspector Curry's hand was on Gina's wrist, holding her in place. Gina's breath sharpened. Her gaze darkened toward Miss Marple. Miss Marple's smile was calm. It's over, my dear. Inspector Curry's voice was cold. Take her. The officer stepped forward. Gina's breath sharpened as they pulled her to her feet. Gina's gaze settled on Miss Marple. You think you've won? Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. I know I have. Gina's smile darkened. This isn't over. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. It's over. The officers led Gina from the room. Juliet's breath was still unsteady. It's really over? Miss Marple's gaze softened. Yes, Juliet. Juliet's eyes widened. How did you know it was Gina? Miss Marple's smile deepened. Simple, my dear. Juliet's breath quickened. What? Miss Marple's eyes darkened. She was the only one who knew where Christian's papers were kept. Juliet's breath hitched. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked once more. Inspector Curry's gaze darkened. Shall I see you home, Miss Marple? Miss Marple's smile was faint. I believe I like that. Miss Marple sat by the window of the drawing room. The golden light of late afternoon casting a soft glow across the polished wood floors. Outside, the manicured gardens of Stonygates stretched into the distance, the hedges neatly trimmed and the rose bushes in full bloom. Juliet sat across from her, clutching a porcelain teacup between her hands, the tension still evident in her expression. Juliet's voice was quiet. I still don't understand. How did you know it was Gina? Miss Marple's gaze softened. It was the little things, my dear, the inconsistencies. Juliet frowned. What inconsistencies? Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly in her lap. Consider the events leading up to Christian's death. Christian had been growing increasingly agitated. He suspected something was wrong, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. Juliet's brow furrowed. Yes, but why would Gina have anything to do with that? Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Because Gina was always nearby, always listening. Juliet's breath quickened. But why would she betray Christian? Miss Marple's gaze darkened. Power, influence, control. Juliet's voice sharpened. But Gina loved Christian. Miss Marple's smile was faint. Gina loved what Christian represented. But when he became an obstacle rather than a stepping stone, her loyalty shifted. Juliet's eyes widened. To Lewis. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Exactly. Juliet's expression twisted. But how could Lewis trust her? Miss Marple's smile deepened. Because Gina was clever. She played the part of the loyal wife perfectly. To Christian and then to Lewis. Juliet's breath hitched. But why help Lewis kill Christian? Miss Marple's gaze darkened. Because Christian was standing in the way of their plans for the foundation. Juliet's brow furrowed. But Christian didn't have any control over the foundation. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. No, but Alexis did. Juliet's breath hitched. You mean? Alexis was a true target. Miss Marple's gaze softened. Indeed. Juliet's voice sharpened. But why kill Christian first? Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly to create confusion, to eliminate the one person who might have uncovered the truth. Juliet's breath quickened, but Alexis died later. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Yes, after Christian's death, Alexis became more cautious. But Gina knew Alexis trusted her. Juliet's eyes darkened. She used that trust against her. Miss Marple's gaze remained calm. Precisely. Juliet's expression twisted. So Louis and Gina were working together from the beginning? Miss Marple's smile was faint. Not quite. Gina manipulated Louis just as much as Louis manipulated her. Juliet's eyes widened. So Gina was planning to betray Louis? Miss Marple's smile deepened. She already had. Juliet's breath sharpened. How? Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked once more. By leaving evidence. Carefully planted evidence that would have led the police to Louis and away from her. Juliet's gaze darkened. And if Louis had been arrested? Miss Marple's smile was calm. Gina would have inherited control of the state. Juliet's breath hitched. But why confess to you? Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. She didn't think I could stop her. Juliet's voice sharpened. But why would she think that? Miss Marple's smile deepened. Because Gina underestimated me. Juliet's breath sharpened. And now? Miss Marple's gaze darkened. Now Gina will face the consequences. Juliet's eyes softened. Because of you. Miss Marple's gaze remained steady. Because of the truth. The drawing room was quiet. The fire crackled low on the hearth. Miss Marple sat alone at the writing desk, a single piece of paper resting beneath her hands. The house was quiet now, the tension that had gripped it for weeks slowly fading into silence. Inspector Curry stepped into the room. She's gone. Miss Marple's gaze remained on the paper. Gina? Inspector Curry's gaze darkened. She's being processed now. She won't be leaving any time soon. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. Good. Inspector Curry's voice was low. You saved a lot of lives, Miss Marple. Miss Marple's smile was faint. Did I? Inspector Curry's gaze sharpened. You uncovered the truth. Miss Marple's gaze softened. Sometimes the truth comes too late. Inspector Curry's brow furrowed. What do you mean? Miss Marple's smile remained faint. Christian. Alexis. Inspector Curry's gaze darkened. We can't bring them back. Miss Marple's eyes softened. No, but we can honor them. Inspector Curry's gaze sharpened. How? Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. By making sure it doesn't happen again. Inspector Curry's gaze darkened. And Gina? Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. She'll pay for what she's done. Inspector Curry's gaze remained steady. And Louis? Miss Marple's smile deepened. He made his choice. Inspector Curry's gaze darkened. And now he'll pay for it. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked once more. Yes. Inspector Curry's gaze softened. You're remarkable, Miss Marple. Miss Marple's smile was faint. I'm just observant. Inspector Curry's gaze sharpened. And what will you do now? Miss Marple's gaze softened. I think I shall finish my knitting. Inspector Curry's smile was faint. And after that? Miss Marple's gaze darkened. I suspect another mystery will present itself soon enough. Inspector Curry's gaze sharpened. You think so? Miss Marple's smile deepened. Human nature, Inspector Curry. Inspector Curry's gaze darkened. And what about human nature? Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. It never changes. It was the following morning when the full weight of the revelations began to settle over Stonygates. The household was unusually quiet. The staff moved about with subdued efficiency, their voices hushed, their movements careful. The shadow of Christian's death and Alexis's tragic end lingered heavily in the air. Miss Marple sat at the breakfast table, a delicate china cup balanced in her hands. Sunlight streamed to the tall windows, illuminating the dust motes that floated lazily through the air. Across from her sat Juliet, her face pale and drawn. Juliet's voice was barely above a whisper. I still can't believe it. Gina, of all people. Miss Marple's gaze was steady. It's always the ones we least suspect. Juliet's hands curled around her coffee cup. But Gina, she seemed so loving. Miss Marple's smile was faint. Love and deception often were the same face, my dear. Juliet's gaze darkened. And Louis? He's going to prison. Miss Marple's expression sharpened. Yes, thanks to Gina's clever maneuvering, there was enough evidence to tie him to Christian's death. Juliet's breath hitched. But Gina's the one who set him up. Miss Marple's smile was faint. Indeed, Gina is quite skilled at covering her tracks. Juliet's eyes narrowed. So how did you know? Miss Marple's gaze softened. Because human nature, my dear, is remarkably predictable. Juliet's breath sharpened. But Gina confessed. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. Yes, but only because she believed she'd won. Juliet's brow furrowed. But why would she confess if she thought she'd won? Miss Marple's smile was calm. Because Gina believed herself untouchable. Juliet's gaze sharpened. And now, Miss Marple's eyes darkened. Now she knows better. Inspector Curry's voice was low. Gina's already started talking. Louis's gaze darkened. What do you mean? Inspector Curry's smile was faint. She's turning on you. Louis's breath hitched. She what? Inspector Curry's gaze sharpened. Gina knew the game was over. She's trying to save herself. Louis's voice sharpened. She wouldn't. Inspector Curry's gaze darkened. She already has. Louis's breath quickened. But I did everything for her. Inspector Curry's smile was cold. That was your first mistake. Louis's gaze twisted. But she loved me. Inspector Curry's expression darkened. Did she? Louis's gaze sharpened. She said. Inspector Curry's gaze hardened. Gina said a lot of things. Louis's breath hitched. But we had a plan. Inspector Curry's gaze darkened. Gina had a plan. You were part of it. Louis's breath sharpened. But she wouldn't. Inspector Curry's gaze darkened. She already did. Louis's shoulders sagged. His hands curled into fists at his sides. What happens now? Inspector Curry's gaze sharpened. You'll stand trial. And Gina, she'll tell the court everything. Louis's gaze darkened. So, I lose everything. Inspector Curry's smile was faint. Looks that way. Louis's breath hitched. But Gina... Inspector Curry's gaze darkened. Gina's already moved on. Louis's gaze twisted. But she... Inspector Curry's gaze hardened. She never needed you. Louis's gaze darkened. His breath quickened. His shoulders slumped as the realization settled over him. Gina had used him, manipulated him. And now, when the truth had come to light, she had left him to take the fall. Inspector Curry's gaze sharpened. Anything you'd like to add? Louis's gaze twisted. His jaw tightened. His hands curled into fists. But he said nothing. Inspector Curry's gaze darkened. Didn't think so. Juliet's voice was soft. What will happen to Louis? Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. He'll face the consequences of his choices. Juliet's gaze darkened. And Gina? Miss Marple's gaze softened. Gina is clever. But even cleverness has its limits. Juliet's gaze sharpened. Do you think she'll get away with it? Miss Marple's smile was faint. No. Juliet's brow furrowed. Why not? Miss Marple's gaze softened. Because Gina miscalculated. Juliet's gaze sharpened. How? Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. Because Gina believed that everyone could be deceived. Juliet's gaze darkened. And... Miss Marple's smile deepened. She forgot about me. Juliet's breath sharpened. And you expose her. Miss Marple's gaze softened. No, my dear. Gina exposed herself. Juliet's gaze darkened. Because of her confession? Miss Marple's smile was calm. Because of her arrogance? Juliet's gaze softened. And now? Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Now Gina will face the truth. Juliet's gaze darkened. And Louis? Miss Marple's gaze softened. Louis made his choice, and now he must live with it. Juliet's gaze sharpened, but he loved her. Miss Marple's gaze softened. Yes, and that was his mistake. Juliet's breath sharpened, because love makes us vulnerable. Miss Marple's smile was faint, because love can blind us. Juliet's gaze darkened, and Gina knew that. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Yes. Juliet's breath hitched. So what happens now? Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. Life will go on. Juliet's gaze darkened, but the damage, Miss Marple's gaze softened. It will heal. In time. Juliet's breath sharpened, and Gina, Miss Marple's smile deepened. She'll answer for her crimes. Juliet's gaze softened, and you, Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. I think I shall enjoy the peace for a while. Juliet's smile was faint. Until the next mystery? Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. Exactly. It was 2 days later when the final pieces of the puzzle fell into place. The house at Stonygates was quieter now. The police had finished their investigation, and most of the household members had either left or retreated into their private corners to process the events that had shaken the once peaceful estate. Miss Marple sat in the sunlit drawing room, her knitting needles clicking softly. The tension that had weighed so heavily on the house had lifted slightly, though the remnants of tragedy still lingered in the air. Juliet entered the room, carrying a silver tray with tea and biscuits. She set it down carefully on the table beside Miss Marple and settled into the chair opposite her. Her expression was pensive. Juliet's voice was soft. So it's over? Miss Marple's gaze lifted from her knitting. Yes, my dear, it's over. Juliet's brow furrowed. Louis and Gina, they both been charged? Miss Marple's smile was faint. Yes, Louis for his role in Christian's death, and Gina for orchestrating it all. Juliet's eyes darkened. And Alexis? Miss Marple's gaze softened. That was Gina's biggest mistake. Juliet's breath hitched. Because she didn't expect Alexis to interfere, Miss Marple's smile deepened. Precisely. Juliet's gaze sharpened. But why would Alexis risk herself? Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. Because she loved Louis. In her own way. Juliet's expression tightened. But Louis was loyal to Gina. Miss Marple's gaze darkened. Love can make us blind to the truth. Juliet's gaze sharpened. And Gina exploited that. Miss Marple's expression darkened. Yes, but in the end, even Gina's cleverness was enough. Juliet's brow furrowed. How did you know Gina was behind it all? Miss Marple's smile was faint. There were too many coincidences. Christian's death was too convenient for Gina's interests. And Louis's loyalty, well, that was always suspicious. Juliet's gaze darkened, because Gina manipulated him. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused. Gina knew exactly how to play Louis. His devotion made him the perfect pawn. Juliet's eyes narrowed. And Alexis? Miss Marple's gaze softened. Alexis was a wild card. Gina couldn't predict her actions. Juliet's brow furrowed. So Alexis sacrificed herself? Miss Marple's gaze darkened. Not intentionally. But Gina underestimated her. Juliet's breath sharpened. And that's why Gina was caught. Miss Marple's smile deepened. Yes. Inspector Curry's gaze was steady. It's over, Gina. Gina's smile was faint. Is it? Inspector Curry's gaze darkened. We have the evidence. The confession. Louis's testimony. Gina's smile sharpened. Louis is weak. Inspector Curry's expression hardened. He's turning on you. Gina's gaze sharpened. He wouldn't. Inspector Curry's smile was cold. He already has. Gina's breath hitched. He. Inspector Curry's gaze darkened. You thought you had control over him. You didn't. Gina's smile twisted. Louis is nothing without me. Inspector Curry's gaze sharpened. And yet here you are. Gina's expression darkened. Her gaze sharpened as the reality of her situation settled over her. Gina's voice was cold. And what happens now? Inspector Curry's gaze hardened. You'll stand trial. And Louis, well, he'll testify against you. Gina's breath sharpened. Her gaze darkened. I underestimated him. Inspector Curry's smile was faint. Yes. Gina's jaw tightened. Her gaze twisted, but she said nothing. Inspector Curry's voice sharpened. Game over, Gina. Gina's gaze narrowed. For now. Inspector Curry's expression darkened. We'll see about that. Juliet's breath sharpened. So Gina was playing a long game. Miss Marple's gaze softened. Yes, but arrogance was her downfall. Juliet's gaze darkened, because she thought Louis would never betray her. Miss Marple's smile was faint, and she thought I wouldn't see the truth. Juliet's breath hitched. But you did. Miss Marple's gaze deepened. Because human nature, my dear, never changes. Juliet's gaze darkened, and Gina thought she was untouchable. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. But no one is untouchable. Juliet's gaze sharpened. Not even Gina? Miss Marple's smile was calm. Especially not Gina. Juliet's breath sharpened. And Louis? Miss Marple's gaze softened. Louis was a victim of his own heart. Juliet's gaze darkened. Do you think he regrets it? Miss Marple's smile was faint. Perhaps, but regret won't save him now. Juliet's breath sharpened. And Gina? Miss Marple's gaze darkened. She'll face the consequences. Juliet's expression softened. And you? Miss Marple's smile deepened. I think I'll enjoy the peace for a while. Juliet's smile was faint. Until the next mystery? Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. Exactly. Justice had been served. The truth had been revealed. But as Miss Marple knew all too well, in the quiet corners of the human heart, shadows of darkness always remained. Justice may prevail, but the human heart remains a mystery. If you love a gripping mystery, hit that like button and subscribe to the Crit Stories. Stay tuned for more captivating tales of intrigue and suspense.